Yeah.
Everything. It's hard to find everything.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I just started the recording. You guys ready for me to let people in?
Sure.
All right, cool. It might take a minute for them to.
So welcome everyone. I think we'll get started in just a few minutes. Let a few more people join us.
Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to start. My name is Joanne Spigonardo, and I am Senior Advisor at the Water Center at Penn. Welcome to the Penn Alumni Water Forum. We have a special treat today. We decided to have a wonderful speaker, Ellen Kohler. She is the inaugural speaker spotlight for the Penn Alumni Water Forum. Ellen recently joined the Water Center after serving as the Program Director for Water Resources at the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center. Her work there focused on water resource management issues, challenging communities in the Mid-Atlantic region, particularly supporting multi-municipal collaborations to improve water quality and integrated water planning to address drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater management. Addressing these challenges has required rethinking financing strategies that provide more equitable outcomes for communities continuing to experience environmental burdens. She brings more than 25 years of experience addressing the legal, regulatory, and policy context of water quality and natural resource challenges to Penn. Today, Ellen will speak about water infrastructure funding in Pennsylvania. She will focus and discuss the partnership of the Water Center at Penn with the University of Maryland to research how communities in 3 areas of Pennsylvania have accessed water infrastructure funds over the past 10 years. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let's make sure that's working. Looks like it is. Thank you very much for that introduction and welcome everybody. I am really glad to be at Penn and glad to meet all of you and look forward to a time when maybe we can all meet together again and maybe have a forum in person. But for today, we're still virtual. I'm hoping everything will hold. It's a bit windy here. I know that some people have had some challenges with internet connection, but I think we'll be okay. So here's my topic for today. I'm going to be talking about funding water infrastructure in Pennsylvania and leveraging federal funding for the greatest impact. Before I turn to that particular topic, I wanted to just give you a little bit of grounding. For those of you who are not familiar with the Water Center, we are a team of 8, including myself most recently, but a couple other new additions. Emma, who's here with us today, is relatively new too. We have a wide range of experience and skills coming from the public sector, the business sector, and the academic sectors. The staff have advanced studies both in across the physical, life, and social sciences. And we also expand our expertise and capacity through our senior advisors like Joanne and others who provide support for our projects and interactions with students. Before I turn to my topic today, I'm just going to go through very quickly 6 projects that we're currently working on to give you a sense of the kind of things that we do at the Water Center. These 6 projects have different funding sources and they range in scope from being national to very local. The first one is working in Pittsburgh with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority to develop a strategic plan for stormwater management. Pittsburgh, as you may know, has significant challenges around flooding, as do many communities. And this is a partnership that we are have with Penn Praxis, which is out of the School of Design. So working with them to do this work. Leading on affordable, resilient water systems in the Great Lakes is a partnership with the Mayor's Innovation Project out of Madison, Wisconsin. Through this project, we're providing a water affordability academy for public utility managers and peer-to-peer engagement to address particular challenges in their communities. Navigate the Flood is a project that has a national scope. Through this project, we developed a tool for water system managers related to helping them address resiliency issues related to flooding. We're hoping to enter into phase 2 of that project going forward. The Roadmap for Water Quality Improvement in the Delaware River is a water quality project analyzing pathogen data that, for the Delaware main stem to better understand the sources of those pathogens and potential solutions for reducing pathogen levels in the main stem of the Delaware. Connecting upstream and downstream communities, a methodology to collaboratively build resilience in the Darby-Cobbs watershed is a very local project. For those of you who may recall, the Darby-Cobbs watershed is just south of the Penn campus. This is a project we're working on in partnership with Drexel University. The funding is from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We're working with community members to identify their priorities and their needs as we put together a green stormwater infrastructure plan for managing stormwater in the watershed. And finally, I have the Southwestern Pennsylvania Water Network and Leadership Incubator. This project is a multi-phase project. We are working across the region around Pittsburgh. So it's focused more in the area around Pittsburgh, as not so much in Pittsburgh. And we are developing a regional peer-to-peer network across government, conservation, and watershed organizations. And also a leadership incubator to build capacity for water resource management in the region. So that gives you a little sense of some of the projects we're currently working on. I'm going to focus my talk today on a project that we actually did in 2020, but in anticipation of some of the federal legislation that has come to pass around the infrastructure funding. So back in 2020, those many years ago, we, there was a lot of conversation going on around federal infrastructure legislation, and knowing that that might be coming to pass, we had conversations with 3 different funders in Pennsylvania. And at the time I was working at the University of Maryland, but was partnering with folks at the Water Center, had conversations with 3 funders in Pennsylvania to say, look, this money, if it were to come through, let's look at how it's been used in the past so we can better enable it hitting the ground for communities in the future. They were amenable, which was very nice, and gave us a little bit of research to do sort of a deep dive in 3 different locations. So we had 1 location in the lower Lehigh, 1 in the upper Conestoga, and 1 in the Sawmill Run watershed. So those are 3 different watersheds in representing the 3 largest river watersheds across Pennsylvania. So the Lehigh is in the Delaware, the upper Conestoga is in the Susquehanna, and the Sawmill Run is in the Ohio River watershed. Our research question was, how accessible are funding resources to Pennsylvania communities outside the major urban areas to address their infrastructure needs across all 3 water sectors: drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. We were looking outside the urban areas because our real concern was whether the smaller communities, the medium and smaller communities, were actually getting the resources that they needed to address the challenges that they had. So although the larger project looked across all 3 sets of communities, I'm going to focus just today on the lower Lehigh. That gives you an example of what we did in all 3 locations. So what we first did was we, after some initial conversations and research, conversations with local community organizations, we selected groups of either around 8 to 10 communities to look at in these subwatersheds. We were looking for communities of varying sizes that all had a shared interest in the same water body. So for the lower Lehigh, it's in the Lehigh River, that had public water utilities or public water authorities, and were also stormwater permittees. So under the Clean Water Act, communities of a certain size have to manage their stormwater runoff in the context of a permitting program that is known as the MS4 program. That stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Program. I'll just refer to it as a stormwater permit in the context of our conversation. This is an aerial of the location where we're working. So this is the Lehigh River. It comes down from the Kittatinny Ridge and the Poconos, comes straight down and makes a really sharp turn right here in Allentown, and then flows out here to the main stem of the Delaware. So this is the main stem of the Delaware here. The communities that we are looking at, we looked at for this, for this research, were right here, right above the bend in Allentown. Our research methodology included, so this was during COVID, we didn't have any in-person meetings, unfortunately. So it included looking at online resources. It included looking at regional information from the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, and other regional initiatives. It included looking at data about water infrastructure from both the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission and from Dr. Laura Patterson at Duke University, who's been doing a lot of research on water infrastructure across the country. We developed and deployed a short survey that went out to borough, township, and municipal entities, 13 of them in total, and then we followed up their survey responses with interviews. And then we also looked at funding information from PennVest and the Commonwealth Financing Authority. PennVest is the state agency in Pennsylvania that manages the funding that comes to the state under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Drinking Water Act. The Commonwealth Financing Authority is a state agency that manages funding that comes to local communities from state sources. So there are a variety of different funding opportunities from the Commonwealth Financing Authority. Some of them relate to water infrastructure. So here's a map of the area that we're talking about in terms of land use. So again, here is the Lehigh, and then it takes a turn to go out to the Delaware. And so the communities we're looking at in this study were right in here. The larger region, as you can tell, is still a bit rural. So all of these areas here that are sort of in this off-white, that's vacant or agricultural land. So it's the larger region is still pretty rural. the communities we're looking at are more developed. And what we were seeing in this particular area is a substantial increase in warehousing land uses. So there are interstates that serve this area and also a regional airport. So now we have Amazon warehouses and FedEx warehouses and those kinds of things being built in the area. And that's one of the most significant land use changes in the area. We also looked at community financial information, so to get a preliminary sense of fiscal capacity across these 8 communities. So we were looking at things like potential, and when we look at potential, we're looking at things like population and number of housing units or households. We're also looking at ability. The ability in terms of financial, our fiscal capacity are the parameters around poverty and median household income give us a sense of ability to pay. So for example, in Allentown has a very high potential in terms of the number of people and households, but very low ability because of the high poverty rates and the lower median household income. South Whitehall, on the other hand, has sort of a moderate, for this set of 8 communities, has sort of a moderate or medium level of capacity, but potential, but a higher ability. They have a higher median household income and much lower poverty rate, for example. So just very preliminary sort of way to look at and understand some of the fiscal capacity among these communities. We then looked at the water systems, and trying to understand the water systems is a bit more challenging than I imagined when we started into this research. So this is a map of the drinking water systems in this region. And we were looking at 4 of them: the Northampton Municipal Borough Municipal Authority, the Catasauqua Authority, and Whitehall, and then the Lehigh County Authority. While we were also looking at South Whitehall as one of the communities, their system was about to merge with the Lehigh County Authority. So we had 4 drinking water systems. You can see that the boundaries for these systems are not regular. They're rather bizarre. The tan area in the background represents the area that the municipality is responsible for in terms of stormwater management. So the municipality has to manage the stormwater here to ensure that before it enters a surface water, that it has managed some of the pollutant loads in that stormwater. So for a community like Whitehall, we've got drinking water being provided from, say, for example, in this area, from the Northampton Borough Municipal Authority. They're providing the drinking water. They treat the drinking water and provide the drinking water. The pipes that deliver that drinking water to the houses in that township, though, that distribution system is generally managed by the township. So the township itself is responsible for making sure that the pipes are in good enough condition to actually get the water to the residents. And then in addition, the township is responsible for that stormwater in that area as well. So that's drinking water. Now we're going to look at wastewater. Here's the map for wastewater. As you can see, the boundaries for these systems do not overlap. And for wastewater, we are looking at 3 different entities that actually have wastewater treatment facilities. That's the Lehigh County Authority here in yellow, Catasauqua, and then also the Northampton Borough Municipal Authority. So again, if you live in Whitehall, your wastewater is treated by Lehigh County Authority. The collection system for that sewage is also managed by the township. So the pipes that send that sewage to the Lehigh County Authority for treatment is managed by the township. So the township is responsible for the stormwater, for the pipes for the drinking water, and for the pipes for the wastewater. And then you have 2 different entities, one managing the wastewater flow and another entity managing or providing drinking water. So rather complex system where we're trying to look at how we're going to manage all the infrastructure needs for these 8 different communities. Then we looked at these 2 financing sources. First, the Commonwealth Financing Authority, and we looked at who's getting funding in these across these 8 different communities, and particularly since 2009. Now, 2009, you may recall, was a time when it was right after the big recession. And Congress had passed the American Rescue and Recovery Act. And there was a lot of money going out through various different sources to communities for what we called shovel-ready projects. And so what we wanted to see was, how did that financing hit the ground? How did that money hit the ground for communities like these 8 communities in the lower Lehigh? So we look back at projects from 2009 coming forward. From the Commonwealth Financing Authority, we found that there were 11 projects. They ranged in size from, not quite 30,000 to almost 900,000. So pretty big range. These are all grants, and that's very important to note. So, coming to the communities with fewer strings attached. I will not say no strings attached, but fewer strings attached. And the source for this funding, is various sources at the state level. So in Pennsylvania, some of it comes from Marcellus shale revenue, and some of it comes from tourism dollars, actually. And so I mentioned that there are a couple of programs that the Commonwealth Financing Authority manages. We've got this H2OPA program, this PA small water and sewer, and then we also have Act 13 monies that are accessible for stormwater management and for across all the water infrastructure needs. So 11 projects, not quite $3 million for these communities. Then we looked at the PennVest dollars. Obviously, smaller number of projects, much larger total, right? So we're almost at $20 million, but these projects are ranging from, more than $600,000 to, almost $10 million. So, and it's very important to note that these funds are all loans. So the community has to be in a position to be able to manage debt financing. So PennVest, great source for larger chunks of money and bigger challenges. I wanted to share with you a little more information about PennVest so that you have a little bit of a better sense of it. It's been in place since 1988, when the state revolving funds were formed under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Drinking Water Act. These are the sources of fundings since 1988. So the total amount of funding that has gone out from PennVest as of the 2020 annual report, 44% of it comes from those federal appropriations that we get on an annual basis. Okay, so that's the largest part of the funding has come from the federal funding. I also wanted to note, here's where that American Recovery and Reinvestment Act dollars came in. So over the entire course of PennVest's existence, 4% of it came from that funding. So that's a pretty significant additional slug of money. These charts over here show us how how that money is going out to communities, again, mostly through loans. So the largest chunk is going for sewer projects, then for drinking water projects. These kinds of stormwater projects that are mentioned, that are outlined in yellow, are for gray infrastructure, so for pipes to manage stormwater. And then the green is for non-point source projects. Generally, these are projects that have to do with using vegetation as a way of managing pollutants before that stormwater gets to a surface water. So we can see that, and this is the annual spending for 2019, 2020. So it gives you a sense of how those funds are spent across through PennVest. So our findings from this research were, pretty straightforward. The Commonwealth Financing Authority grants are really important for these small communities. They fill a really important funding gap, and it'd be wonderful if there were more of these resources available. PennVest is accessible only for those larger projects where a community is willing and able to go into debt financing. And that willing part is really important. What we found is that most communities are not comfortable with the idea of going into debt around managing stormwater yet. They're not there yet. Drinking water, wastewater, those are seen as really important things that we need to have in place, more willing to go into debt, not feeling that way yet about stormwater. We also found that it's very hard to get to either funding, either the Commonwealth Financing Authority or PennVest, if that community does not have money to do the planning for the project first. Those resources do not, neither one of those entities have resources for planning. These communities have huge backlogs for maintenance. That's not surprising. it's very hard for local officials to raise property taxes or earned income taxes, which are the two major sources of general fund dollars for communities in Pennsylvania. Very hard for local elected officials to raise those taxes to support what needs to happen for the drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure in their communities. So generally, we need more accessible funding for smaller and medium-sized municipalities, particularly around planning and stormwater infrastructure. So taking all that, now we've had a new slug of federal funding. So what are we seeing from this new slug of federal funding? So the first thing I want to look at is this American Rescue Plan Act funding. This funding came through in the fall of 2021. It's often referred to, well, it's often also referred to as the OPA dollars. These dollars can be used for a variety of different uses, but particularly they can be used, specifically outlined in the legislation, was they can be used to invest in water, sewer, and stormwater infrastructure. This funding came as direct payments to municipalities at all levels. So counties got funding, townships got funding, boroughs got funding, cities got funding, and it all came as just direct payments. Use it for one of these sources here, and you're good. So very flexible, very simple. And what we're finding is that communities are starting to use these funds for water infrastructure, either to directly fund projects that they had on their, like capital improvement planning, things that they had wanted to do, or they are purposefully setting that money up in a water fund so that they can leverage it to bring in more funding. So if they wanted to go after a grant and that grant requires matching, they will use their ARPA dollars to match that grant so that they can bring in twice as much if the grant requires a 50-50 match, for example. So we're starting to see those communities make those choices on their own to use those dollars for funding water infrastructure. The other piece of federal legislation that came through recently, I think if you haven't been paying attention, is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This chart is from a resource from the White House that just shows all of the different things coming in and what, from the way they've categorized it for water. So $64 billion. There's a lot here. I know it's small text. What we really want to be paying attention to most specifically here are these two lines here, the 11.7 billion for those two revolving fund programs. There's more coming into the revolving funds. This is for lead service line, this 15 billion. So every year for 5 years, there's going to be $11.7 billion coming into these two states, I should say, going out to the 50 states through these two sources. The normal level of funding for both of these is 1.7 billion. So this is a 10-fold increase in the amount of funding going out to states through the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act revolving fund. So it's a huge slug of money. And it's over the next 5 years. One of the things that's interesting about the funding is that there is a requirement that 49% of it go out to communities in the form of grants for under-resourced communities. Now, each state gets to design what that grant program looks like. PennVest currently has a grant program, so they could just push more money out through their existing grant structure. EPA is coming out with some guidance at the end of February. It may speak to the grant program. We're really not sure. But it's really wonderful that this legislation recognized the needs for more grants. There is no, though, mention of any money for planning. That doesn't mean that the states can't have can't use their discretion to set aside money for planning, but there's no requirement in the federal legislation that any of this money be used for planning dollars. There is a lot of discussion in the water resources world around technical assistance for this funding. Meaning that that communities need help in figuring out how to get this funding in place to meet the needs that they have. And I think we need to make sure it's absolutely true that communities are going to need help. But I think what we need to make sure is that that technical assistance is provided in a way that is defined by the community and not by the technical assistance providers, right? Like, so the communities have to decide, hey, yes, first of all, I want technical assistance, and here's how I want it done. And most importantly, that technical assistance needs to be structured in a way where we're building the capacity within the community so that when that technical assistant provider is gone, the community still understands and knows how to apply for those resources, how to be financing the work that they need to get done. And it doesn't matter, there's a lot of talk in the water resources world, you know, about where that technical assistance money might come from. It could come from the state, from the federal, state, or local level, or even from philanthropic dollars. Regardless of where the funding comes from, I think we need to be really thoughtful about how that money is provided to technical service providers, and that it's not overspent on the providers as opposed to on the communities. And finally, the last thing I want to say about the infrastructure, the federal infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is that there are also other sources of funding that can be used, can be spent to protect and improve water quality if they're spent correctly. And we really need to pay attention to the way that the transportation dollars are spent with that, in that regard. Building more roads is obviously not going to be a great thing for water quality. Managing runoff from roads in a way that helps address the pollutants and could be transformative in terms of both what's happening with our larger storm events and also in terms of managing pollutants that come from roads. So that is what I had to share with you today about some research that we did in anticipation of this federal legislation, and now what we're seeing in terms of the federal legislation that's actually come through. We have a lot to learn about what communities will do with the additional funding, and 5 years to make some really big changes that could be really important in Pennsylvania. Happy to handle any questions.
Ellen, I'll take a stab at the first question. I know that you spoke about small municipalities, but I was wondering, can you elaborate on ways that the city of Philadelphia can continue to improve infrastructure, and which areas need the most work?
Well, Philadelphia is facing a number of large challenges. And while I could go on about this, Howard is on the call, and Howard has a lot more specific understanding of some of the challenges that Philadelphia is facing. I will say that one of them is absolutely managing large storm events, as we've seen. I mean, we had a large storm event with Hurricane Ida that flooded, you know, major parts of the city, and learning how we're going to manage those events better. There's no way we're going to avoid all flooding, given the situation, the way that the city has been built, but how we can manage those events better to have less impact and to ensure that people who are impacted the most get the most resources. That's definitely one of the city's bigger challenges. Howard, I'm sure you have more to say.
Just that, you know, when I came in as water commissioner, our budget was about $150 million a year for capital expenditures. And we're now up to about 350. So this is over a 10-year time period. So the expenditures is quite high. And we have gone after Penvest and have a couple of projects in that is probably up to about $150 million. We're kind of like the big kid on the block, and obviously, if our projects in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and the more that we take up of that, the less there is for the rest of the state. And the politics of the state is interesting too, and you have to think about that also. But Philly has a good capacity to be able to do this either through bonding from Wall Street or bonding from Penvest. The issue is that the spread between the interest rates on Wall Street and the ones that Penvest offer is not that large, and the cost of issuing this kind of credit is significant. So if we're going to Wall Street each year for $300 million, going to Penvest means we're doing twice as much effort and expenditures to get the money. So it's something that we kind of limit and just play by ear. But of course, it's always nice to work with Penvest and look at $100, $200 million projects, or in some cases, maybe just $30 million. Be nice.
Yeah, I'm very glad, Howard, you brought that point up. Penvest funding, so all of the SRF programs across the country, their interest rates have to be significantly lower. And so if a community is going to use debt financing, it absolutely should go to its state revolving fund first. So I see that there's another question in the chat about building rebuilding an Amazon warehouse. And is there a fast and easy way to determine an infrastructure score for water and sewer? So that's a very interesting question, Albert. And one of the things that's most interesting, I think, about this kind of development is that warehousing probably doesn't actually use that much drinking water and wastewater capacity. You probably have a couple of, bathrooms for folks to use when they're going in and out. The larger impact is on stormwater because they are enormous and they cover a huge amount of area. And so that's what create that impervious cover, that, covering that much of land where the stormwater cannot infiltrate on its own. That's what has the biggest impact in terms of water resources in the area. And because most of our communities haven't focused as substantially on stormwater management to date, we don't have a good method for these kinds of communities to say, oh, a development like this is going to translate into this kind of impact for my community in terms of what we have to do to manage stormwater. In other words, the costs of managing the stormwater from that site because of my stormwater permit. I think, I think there are probably some pretty easy ways of saying, we know there are some pretty easy ways of translating. If you have X amount of impervious cover, you're going to have these kinds of challenges. But I haven't seen a tool yet where we actually have a score. And that probably would be a very useful tool for some communities just to get a high level sense of, oh, maybe we don't want this kind of development. Now, of course, there are all sorts of political challenges with, around managing development that are not as straightforward as just what the stormwater impacts are. But I think it would be a very helpful tool to have that kind of a score. Yeah, it's a good point, Albert, in terms of scoring for due diligence. Yeah, I'm thinking, I see where you're coming from. I'm thinking of it from a planning perspective and thinking about the community's role in the land use planning decisions. But you're absolutely right in terms of from the other side of things, from the commercial side of things, having due diligence there. At the moment, we haven't transferred those costs sufficiently, I would say, from the community to those private landowners. And that's part of what a score like that could help do, not just for the community, but also, and for the commercial landowner to understand the impacts of that stormwater management.
So one thing I found fascinating, you spoke about the technology providers for these infrastructure measures to take place. Did you identify the technology providers? Just curious.
Well, so when we talk about technical assistance or technical service providers, there are a variety. Generally, what we're talking about is organizations that specialize in wastewater systems or in drinking water systems or in stormwater systems. And so often they have some engineering expertise. They might have project management expertise. And there are different structures set up across the country in terms of these technical service providers. In Pennsylvania, and actually in a lot of the mid-Atlantic states, there are a couple of organizations. One's called RCAP, which is the Rural Communities Assistance Program, and another is called Rural Water. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Drinking Water SRF, they help fund this technical service provider network. And so they can go out and work with a particular community system and say, oh, you're having a challenge on the drinking water, say, oh, you're having a challenge with nitrates. Well, maybe we want to think about how we're, a different way of treating the drinking water source, or, you're losing too much water in your system from the drinking water plant to the customer. Can we have a strategy where we're lining the pipes? How much would that cost? And so helping those system managers figure out how to address the challenges that they have. there's a little bit of that structure on the wastewater side. There is no structure like that with respect to providing assistance to communities for stormwater. So that is a real need across, certainly in the mid-Atlantic states, and for more developed areas in the country, there is definitely a need for more technical service providers there. So in that regard, Joanne, we need to establish a set of, service providers around stormwater management. And I think that's absolutely a direction that we'll see, or a capacity that we'll see growing. Because of larger storm events, communities are much more aware of their need to pay more attention to stormwater management. And, as a result of these large storm events and seeing more flooding in their communities, they realize that it is absolutely on their plate to do a better job of managing stormwater. But, in the past, people didn't come into community meetings and say, oh, I'm really worried about stormwater. They come in Pennsylvania, we have a township-based local government, so it's relatively small municipal units. And a lot of those municipalities manage the roads, for example. And so you did have people coming into those meetings and saying, I've got potholes. I don't like what's going on in this road. They weren't coming in and saying, I'm worried about stormwater. They're now coming in and saying, we're worried about stormwater because we have, because of flooding. And I can't, when it floods, I can't get out of my house. I can't get to the hospital. I can't get food. And those are really big concerns. So I think that's something that kind of capacity, the focus on stormwater is going to be very different in the next 5-10 years.
Very interesting. I know that there's some students on the call. I know one of the alums that worked with me in the past is on the call, Emily Newton. So I'm going to cold call on you, Emily, to ask a question. I know you're interested.
This has been very interesting. And in speaking about the last topic, I was going to ask, in working with these communities, what kind of recognition you've seen on their part about climate change impacts, and how they are thinking about using this, influx of funding to help plan for climate change impacts in general and in relation to water.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely becoming more of a focus, and particularly, as I said, in these communities because of the large storm events. So in most of the communities that I've been working with in Pennsylvania, that's the biggest climate impact. It's the large storm events and what that means for their communities. So there's the flooding of roads, but there's also, what does that mean in terms of those water systems? Because if those water systems are not functioning well, if they're not, if the pipes have a lot of leaks in them, for example, you'll get a lot of infiltration from, if you have a large storm event and those stormwaters infiltrate into the soil and then are infiltrating into the drinking water and wastewater pipes, then you have a lot more flow in those pipes. One, it's not good for the drinking water too, but on the wastewater side, you have more water flowing into those wastewater pipes and you have a capacity issue. So in Lehigh, in the lower Lehigh, this was a really big problem. It's called separate sewer overflows. And so their system quite literally was not big enough to manage the amount of development they had, plus these large storm events, not because they have a combined system, but because they were getting storm waters into the system from leakage. So, that kind of an issue is really, having a system that is well maintained is really important in terms of being resilient to these large storm events in the future. For the drinking water systems, I think it's really going to be a challenge around, are these large storm events going to create pollutant issues for that source water? And that varies depending on the source water. So I also have been working with a lot of communities in southern Chester County, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And because of the geology in that area, they have a lot of issues with nitrates. So it's a very agricultural area. There's a lot of fertilizers used and land application of animal waste. And so when we get, with rains, more of those nutrients get into the soils and get into the groundwater. And we have high nitrate levels, nitrates being one of those pollutants, one of those nutrients. And so those systems have a really big challenge in terms of how to manage that nitrate level. And they'll be, looking at ways that they can work with farmers, frankly, to see if they can implement ag BMPs ag best management practices that will reduce the amount of nitrates going into the groundwater, because some of those public municipal systems pull from groundwater. In addition, a lot of the domestic, so we looked at communities with public systems. For the people in the even more rural areas, they're pulling most of their water, their domestic water, from wells, and they're on septic systems. So if those aquifers are full of nitrates, then it impacts those domestic systems as well. So the large storm events have varying impacts depending on where you are and what your source water is. Another thing we see with these large storm events is really high sediment levels. So I live in Wilmington, Delaware. The city of Wilmington pulls water from Brandywine Creek. When we get a really heavy storm event, Brandywine Creek is full of sediment. They cannot pull water from there. So then they have to go to their reservoir as a backup. It's more expensive for them to use the water from the reservoir. They'd rather not have to do that, but it's less expensive to use the water from the reservoir than to try to get all the sediment out of the water that's coming down the stream itself. So there's a lot that, there's some part of it is the impacts on the source waters. Part of it's how do I create redundancies within my community so that if one part of that system, fails, or the source that I'm getting drinking water from there is affected, but the other one isn't. So there are a lot of challenges there. I think communities are definitely the municipal staff, the folks whose job it is to manage these systems, they fully understand the challenge. One of the things that we are now starting to see is elected officials who are recognizing that, yes, we do need to pay attention to this. We're starting to see that change. We're starting to see elected officials across Pennsylvania who are more willing, quite frankly, to spend municipal dollars on helping their community become more resilient. Unfortunately, it's because of all these large storm events. But that's one of the biggest challenges I see. In other communities, I haven't heard this as much in Pennsylvania. In other communities, there are resiliency challenges with water systems because they're seeing saltwater, if they're dependent on a groundwater source and they see saltwater intrusion, that creates a big challenge for them, right? Like that is not a good thing for a drinking water system. So it depends a little bit on where they are, but we're definitely seeing more of an understanding. And these resources, are absolutely needed at the community level to be able to make the investments that we need to become more resilient.
I see that Ryan Seeger, who's the staff congressional transportation and infrastructure lead, he's on the call. Ryan, I hate to put you on the spot, but it would be great if you could join in the conversation.
So I was trying to lurk in the background for a while just to hear what's going on. Us congressional backbenchers like to just listen sometimes. No, I really appreciate it. I apologize for being late to the meeting. No, I appreciate kind of hearing some of the concerns you guys are here about as well. I think you're identifying a lot of the challenges that we also see in terms of resiliency needs in local communities, financial needs in terms of a lot of local communities, especially kind of the loan grant component that I know Howard and I have talked about multiple times before. The kind of the urgency to get this money out the door. Obviously, let's be blunt, politically, there's going to be a strong need to kind of make sure this money actually is doing things quickly. And so that's going to be a thing as well. But also, historically speaking, when we did this back in 2009 with the Recovery Act, while there was a lot of pressure to get this out in the 1-year time frame, we got feedback after it was done was, did we fund the right projects? And that so again, it's that
right.
fine tension. I'm in the listening mode. I don't know if I have anything to say, but I really appreciate you guys kind of having these discussions, and it's good to hear from other people, other voices in this world.
Well, so I didn't know that you were on the call, but so we could talk a little bit more about transportation. And
That's why I'm hiding.
I know, really. Well, because I am very concerned. I shouldn't say concerned. I really want to make sure we also focus on the role that these transportation dollars have in terms of water quality, because if they're not spent well, we will see it won't be good, right?
Mhm.
And so, you know, and knowing that we have this window of time with a certain secretary at the head of the Department of Transportation, you know, one of the things that it's my understanding that there isn't as much framing around the federal dollars that it's going, that it from the on the transportation side going to the states, that there's a lot of discretion at the state level for how those funds are spent. True?
So you're keying on a point of contention between us and our friends in the Senate,
Yeah, I know.
and how this all played out. I think what DOT is trying to do through its implementation guidance, especially with respect to kind of the fix it first versus kind of add capacity issue, is
Yeah.
trying to lean in as much as they can to try and put some parameters.
Yeah.
I have also seen that, again, not everything's political, but everything's political. You know, there's been some pushback that I've seen that, you know, at least some, you know, some administrations at the state level have said that we're not going to do that. We're going to kind of just spend the money as freely as we want to. So I think there's like in the water world,
Yeah.
there's tension in the surface world of what's the sustainable way to invest this money, you know, both from the highway side and the transit side and kind of the soft pass side.
Yeah.
So I think these same tensions are playing out there. I would say from the members who I work with, that is absolutely what they intended.
Yeah.
I think there will be those who will disagree that that's what the language says. And I think that's going to be where the rub's going to be.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to also mention, just because you're here, want to mention one other thing that's related to the stormwater piece, because one of the biggest challenges for communities in Pennsylvania is their interactions with PennDOT. So PennDOT is the
Mhm.
state Department of Transportation. As you can imagine, PennDOT manages a lot of impervious cover across the state, and there's a permit out
Mhm.
there to manage that stormwater. What has been really frustrating for communities in Pennsylvania is that PennDOT does not partner with them to manage the stormwater runoff challenges in their communities that are related to what happens from a PennDOT road, you know, so runoff from a PennDOT road that then ends up on a municipal road, and then PennDOT goes, oh, not our problem.
Mhm.
So like there are, so, you know, so it does sound like you're aware of that. I'll just tell you that this is what I hear from the municipalities that I work with all the time, that PennDOT is not a good partner. They,
Mhm.
you know, they don't come and say, let's work on a project together. They also do not pay for those areas where they're saying that it's the municipality's responsibility to manage the runoff there. They're not willing to pay a stormwater fee. So, you know, for the land there, so it's sort of a double whammy for that community. Like, oh, you're generating a stormwater
Mhm.
problem. Okay, we'll take care of it, but that means we're going to charge you a stormwater fee for that. Oh, and you're not going to pay your stormwater fee.
Yep.
Right.
You're unfortunately rudely aware of this issue. I will tell you that at least there has been an attempt to try and get our arms around it. I think the last 2 or 3 surface transportation bills have incorporated into the municipal planning side kind of an awareness of impacts of increased impervious surfaces on water quality, and to try and tie those. So obviously in the air world, you can be in a non-attainment area, and there, if you're a non-attainment area, there has to be some implications that in terms of the CMAQ plans.
Right.
We're trying to replicate that in the water world in terms of, as you're doing municipal planning, as you're doing area-wide planning, are you taking into consideration the impact of the surface transportation on local water resources, and try and build that in as a project cost rather than as a compliance issue or as a permit issue or unfortunately as a deferral issue. We haven't gotten it right yet, and I will tell you there's a significant amount of pushback from DOTs statewide. I mean, it's not just PennDOT, it's so, but it is something that we are wrestling with. We hear it from the municipal wastewater treatment facilities all the time, is yes, ultimately they get tagged with the cost of treating this. It's ultimately their permit responsibility, right? When it actually should be, from an MS4 standpoint, it should be the owner of the road's responsibility. So don't have a good answer for you, but it's definitely something we've been over the last decade trying to get our arms around, and we're making, I would say, incremental progress.
Well, that's good to hear that you think there's progress. That's better than I thought.
Incremental.
Yeah, incremental. I'll note that Albert put a comment in the chat about the need for a national resilience plan. You know, ideally, that would be ideal. That, you know, helps us think about how we're doing public infrastructure. That would have to come through some national legislation, right? Like we don't have that kind of legislation in place. That I will say that we are seeing more of that at the state and local level. A lot more, and some of this can happen through the hazard mitigation planning that communities do. And so that's the other place where we could have a lot more engagement in terms of how we're addressing resiliency and how we're addressing water systems in that context too. So that's another place to look in your communities, is what's happening in terms of hazard mitigation. And, you know, so this infrastructure funding also has a big slug of money that's coming through FEMA. And ideally, a lot of that funding will be put in place in a way that we're looking at pre-disaster planning as opposed to post-disaster, you know, fixes. And so like Albert, that's where I see the closest thing that we could get to a, you know, sort of a national resilience plan, given the current legislation that we have, you know, federal legislation that we have in place. So, and I would really, you know, encourage, you know, if any of you are looking for a place to engage in your communities, you know, that's another place to consider, is what's happening with your hazard mitigation planning, and you know, helping your community have a really robust plan in place.
So I think we may have time for one more question. Does anyone else have any questions?
Well, I'm just noting Albert's last point here about a lot of the sewer plants are in the 100-year floodplain. Absolutely true, right? Like our sewer systems are all gravity systems, right? So the plants are at the bottom, and that's, you know, so they're the lowest level. It's going to be a huge challenge for us in some places. Howard, do you want to talk about the systems in Philadelphia and what kind of challenges they're facing, those treatment plants?
Well, so far we're okay, but,
Yeah.
but beyond the treatment plants themselves are all the outfalls. And in Philadelphia, we have 164 outfalls, and we're trying to do something about them. But in the meantime, there's more and more water pressure from the river pushing the water in the wrong direction, back towards the houses rather than out towards the river. Right. And so that's a huge problem that is not really being addressed at all, as far as I know, by anyone nationally at this point, and it's going to be really big. Just going back to what Ryan was saying, and you about PennDOT and other groups, we were very successful in Philly. We got I-95, the expansion of I-95 through the city of Philadelphia, had no stormwater management associated with it. And they said they didn't have, their first position was they didn't have, they were the state, they didn't have to follow local ordinance and requirements. And then they came back and they said, well, we're adding one lane in each direction, and we will do stormwater management for that addition. And before it was over, they had agreed to do the entire stormwater management for the entire section of 95 that was being expanded in Philadelphia. So I'm not sure where the politics were for that, and I don't think there's anybody here from PennDOT on this call here, but there are ways to do this, and it's so important. I mean, it's such a major impervious landowner in our state and around the country that it seems kind of crazy that they're not involved with the management of the water that falls on their property.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen. We really enjoyed learning about your research about infrastructure funding in Pennsylvania. You're doing really meaningful work, important work that's desperately needed. So thank you for all the work that you're doing and for speaking to the Penn Alumni Water Forum today. I also would like to thank all the participants and the great questions. And please stay tuned for our second speaker spotlight on March the 18th, which will feature Rekha Varma. She is a Wharton alum, and she is also the president of the Atlanta Penn Alumni Club. She will be speaking about water risk. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you too.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
bye.